From FingerLakes1.com, welcome to episode 44 of the Debrief Podcast presented by FL1 News. Jackie Augustine and Josh Durso here inside the FingerLakes1.com studio talking politics, news, headlines, and much more. Everything from around upstate New York. Politics getting so complicated. Upstate New York is so complicated.
It is, and it's faster now. Everything's coming at us right now.
Everything has to be done. I have a new theory. In government, everything is done in 2 months or not at all.
Yes, that's right. It's either a crisis or a standstill. Yeah.
And it seems like everything is a crisis now. Last night, the Seneca County Board of Supervisors received an update. They received a little presentation from the Board of Elections, both election commissioners, basically outlining all the things that are going to be changing. And obviously, we're going to talk about those changes in the upcoming races, some of the races that we know about maybe later in the show. But let's start knocking off some of these state items. There are so many state items getting thrown in. For anybody, I know we received a couple messages in the last few weeks, some folks saying we're not talking enough about local politics. Point taken. But at the same time, unfortunately, there are so many different state issues that have been popping up that have very real local implication.
Yeah.
We have to talk about them. And to everyone else who's been, saying awesome, kudos, keep going, about us talking about all those things. Thanks to you guys too. Sexual harassment hearings. Where do we? This is one of those. So, was it this session or the previous session where some legislative changes were made?
Well, last session there were the set of agreements, but they were made in part between the former leadership, which included, remember that there was that independent Democratic caucus, which was really like extra Republicans who had run on the Democratic ticket in order to give the Senate control to Republicans. So Jeff Klein, one of the senators who led up that independent Democratic caucus, reached some agreement about sexual harassment in the workplace reforms. I would note the agreement was made entirely by the guys in Albany. No one asked the women. And Jeff Klein himself had been accused of sexual harassment. So after the election, a lot of people were talking about the need to revisit that it was rushed, that it was just kind of a political thing to try to help some people, some guys, images, and not really to do anything significant. So actually today, like an hour from now, if people are watching us live or listening live, the Senate's going to be having these hearings, and they are going to be streamed live. But it's interesting because they're actually going to hear from women who have had sexual harassment complaints against legislators, male legislators. And why does this matter, right? Getting back to the point about us talking about state stuff. A ton of state news is filtered through downstate publications with an emphasis on how it's going to affect downstate only. And I think people need to think about the upstate implications. First of all, a lot of the people involved in this are not just in the city, but also the amount of money that has been paid out to settle these allegations really is substantial and affects the state budget, which definitely affects upstate interests because, we would like our fair share of those funds, and it's not good for us if the monies are diverted to pay for people's indiscretions or alleged indiscretions. So anyway, I just found it interesting, and I wanted to say also that Cynthia Nixon, the former gubernatorial candidate who ran against Governor Cuomo, is participating in these. So I would like to see, I was not one of her supporters, but I can say that I like it when I see that people who have not won an election actually stay involved. And I hope they're staying involved because they really care and not because they're trying to set themselves up for another election. But I think we need more people hanging in there. So it sounds like she's doing that. So I'd like to give credit where credit's due. And I think it's a good thing that she'll participate in that.
Yeah, so obviously I like the sounds of hearings, they're awesome. Like to see it backed up with some real legislation,
Right.
something that can maybe produce some real tangible change.
Yeah, that's the hope.
It seems like, and I don't know this, unfortunately, I don't know this issue that well, but it does seem to me like one of the big issues at play here is the transparency side of it, and anything that could be done to maybe help that part of it along, I think would go a very long way.
Right.
But, I think like a lot of the issues that we see and that we end up talking about in Albany, they're so intricate, and there are so many sort of, and we'll call them sub-issues, but, other interests tied to them, other issues and other interests tied to them, that it becomes difficult to change one without having unintended side effects on other things. I think about Brittany's Law and how some folks in the domestic violence community, specifically some organizations who were seeing funding, weren't that thrilled with that piece of legislation, and was typically a big one of the big sort of tidal waves against it every year when it was going through the process in the last couple of years. So I just think anything we can do to make up some ground so that those issues can be sort of siloed and addressed individually, I think might be better, or net positive for New Yorkers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with this sexual harassment issue, the way it was treated previously, is that nobody was really dealing with the fact that this has significant implications for campaign finance laws and general ethics. Because do you really want a legislator able to use campaign funds to pay off somebody who is alleging that they've been sexually harassed, as a way of keeping that particular person in office? Because if, for all of our concerns about campaign finance and the idea that maybe somebody's influence or someone's legislation is going to be influenced by the money they've received and the purpose it was used for, I mean, there you go. If somebody bails you out from a allegation of sexual harassment that would hurt your image and, hurt your career, it's hard for me to see that legislator wouldn't then feel like they owe that person something. Because, I mean, someone who's doing that stuff in the first place has problems. And then it's not a far leap to assume that they would somehow be influenced negatively to help out someone who had given them some cash to take care of it.
Yeah, and I think maybe part of the concern, or part of the reason maybe that this doesn't get the kind of attention that some folks might like to see, is just because of how big it really is.
Yeah.
And when it's sort of like when you start that ball rolling down the hill and the momentum it will gather, especially if significant legislation is passed along the way, you're going to have to make some big changes in other areas.
Right.
And you're going to have to follow that issue for 4 or 5 years, passing new legislation every year almost. And that's one of the things where I'm not sure the political will ever exists when you're talking about an issue like that, because most legislators, unfortunately, I don't think they think much beyond 2 years or a year and a half, just because they're up for re-election every 2 years.
Yeah.
So,
perpetual
I think
campaigning.
Right. And I think that's part of the challenge that comes along with it. But one thing that doesn't seem to ever die is this idea of splitting New York State into two states.
Or three.
Assemblyman Stephen Hawley, a Republican from Western New York, wants to see a referendum on the ballot. That means on the back, flip your ballot over. He says his argument is, and this was one of the things that I read, he says there are plenty of referendum issues on every ballot that are solely of interest to those in downstate New York City area. So why not put something on the ballot in terms of in terms of referendum that is exclusively of interest to upstate? Yeah. We've talked about this before. My thought process on it is, how are you going to see any different in outcome if you put it on as a referendum, say this year or next year, as opposed to any other election, meaning the urban centers are going to ultimately decide whether that happens or not.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, I just find the proposal silly because, like you said, a person complaining that downstate interests control our politics wants to put a ballot initiative that would be, by his own logic, be controlled by downstate interests on the ballot. And what is particularly troubling to me is that there are, multiple proposals, that there would be downstate, which would be called New York, would stay New York, and upstate, which would be called New Amsterdam. Or he then unveiled this new proposal that would actually divide the state into 3 pieces. Maybe the southern tier would merge with Pennsylvania. I'm not sure we've asked them if they're interested in that, either the people in the southern tier or the people in Pennsylvania. Or that would be its own area. And it sounds a lot like Brexit because he keeps saying, and it's not just him, I don't mean to pick on him, he's the latest person to bring this up. This is always good for some kind of early term brownie points with certain constituencies to bring up this separation issue. But he keeps saying the details will come later. Let's just vote on the idea and then we'll get the details. Well, let me tell you something, not to be cliche, but the devil's in the details. And if people actually look at the economics of the state, we benefit from a lot of the wealthy people who are taxed in New York City putting that money into the state's coffers to fund some upstate programs. So I'm not really sure that on an economic issue you would have a win, but I don't really think this is about economics at all. I mean, in his own statement, he says that this is about a socially progressive liberal agenda being foisted upon the good people of upstate New York. And I just don't think you're going to legislate your way through a moral issue like that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think a lot of this is more or less tied to folks in upstate feeling like the state is too liberal or pushing too far to the left and wanting to create this conservative haven.
Compound.
I mean, I'm just not really. And, when they talk about splitting New York State up into, 3 or 2 parts, I mean, really what you're talking about at that point, if you take the New York City money out of the equation, you're talking about not much would actually change. The same folks are going to get elected upstate as are getting elected right now. The only thing that's going to change is that the services provided by the state are drastically going to change.
Right.
That is what, and I don't think anybody's really thought beyond that. I think a lot of legislators get tied up in, we just want to spend less. And that's fine. Right. But you have to think about what the real world implication of that is. Yeah. And I don't think any of the folks who talk about disassembling New York State really understand or have thought about how this would actually execute. Right. And, how it would be phased in, because it would have to be phased in. Yeah. And I think the other aspect of this is I think New York State could get into a place where splitting would be doable, but I think the first thing that has to happen so that there isn't that sort of shock to the system would be that the state would have to be governed by a more fiscally conservative entity or person or whatever the case may be, or at the very least maybe like a manager figure, kind of like what the Mark Molinaro campaign was trying to do this last time around, to sort of clean things up first, get the state into kind of like a half better place, and then reevaluate whether splitting is really necessary, and then figuring out how you would execute that part of it.
Right. Well, that would be a logical and reasonable way to proceed with a process that would examine that. But we're talking about elected officials, and there seems to be an absence of logic and reasonableness and patience.
Yeah, but this is, that's the thing that's kind of like, you can, even if it is a referendum in the next 2 years, or put on the ballot in some way, shape, or form, it's not going to change. It cannot be taken seriously in present form, given present, the way things exist in New York State right now. It just can't.
Yeah. I wish that all the people who want to separate would just work on pushing for more equity, like campaign for fiscal equity, getting more money into rural and kind of underperforming upstate schools, that's something that was actually, there was a court ruling. We were supposed to get more money. A lot of upstate districts were supposed to get a larger allocation. That just keeps getting pushed down the line. And that would be a good place to spend some effort, some time, some political capital.
But okay, so here's my issue with that. And that's why I said before that all these issues are sort of intertwined and connected. It's like, okay, so say you start spending more in upstate on education, K through 12 education.
Yep.
What happens when those kids graduate? They're going to go to college. Maybe they stay locally and they go locally. We have a lot of great 2- and 4-year institutions in the Finger Lakes and in upstate New York. But what do they do after that? If the economic situation in the Finger Lakes, in upstate New York, is not such that it can support them after they complete and they finish all of that, that investment is not going to bear out the way I think some folks hope it would. You know what I mean? Like, it is good. I am not saying it is a bad thing to invest. I'm just saying, like, we really need to take, like, a multi-pronged approach to breathing life back into upstate New York.
I agree. There is no single silver bullet solution here. No, I agree with you.
And part of it, too, is like, you talk to people who own businesses, and what do they say? What's the first thing they always complain about? Taxes.
Yep.
And it's justified.
Yep. Like
New York State businesses are taxed unreasonably compared to the competition, which is every other state. And, I think if the legislature somehow got to a point where they addressed that and they addressed the school spending, I don't know how you do both of them at the same time. I think then you could really peel off the shackles and let, upstate New York would really thrive.
Right.
But,
I agree with you.
And then you start talking about, like, what's the will? Is there will?
Yeah.
Is there will to do that?
No, because, the thing is, these issues, you're never going to get 100% consensus, which means you are going to irritate or alienate some people. And we don't have a lot of elected officials who are comfortable with that. They want to get reelected. They don't really want to legislate. That's not true of everybody, right? But too often, that's what we find. We're electing politicians. We're not electing legislators. So that's got to change. But hopefully, it will.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was a meeting which was held yesterday in Wayne County, basically to address derelict properties. The properties, the zombie homes, all of that good stuff. And mainly because you drive through, and I think a lot of the counties, I see a lot of press releases from the counties and entities associated with the counties in the Finger Lakes. I think I saw one this past week from Schuyler County. Seneca County has an effort that they've been pushing towards. I'm not sure about Ontario County. I'm sure they're doing something to some degree.
I'm not aware of any countywide effort.
But this seems to be, when you drive through any community, especially when you drive through some of the older villages, this is where people get really sort of hung up on this, like, well, look at all these terrible, and it's a problem that's actually worse, I think, in the urban centers, the Rochesters, the Syracuse, the Buffaloes, because you have that, I guess maybe just more attention is being drawn to it there. But this is, I think, maybe one of the big problems. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about AIM funding. The aid and assistance for the municipalities, which I think we're also going to talk about in a little while. But when we were having that sort of debate about, like, taxable what is actually taxable versus not taxable, and I think that's where a lot of folks tend to get a little bit frustrated because they hear somebody say, well, you have all this property that is taxable, or you have all this property that could potentially be worked with, but there doesn't really seem to be anyone focusing on addressing it.
Right.
Now, I would be very interested to know, and I don't know how many people turned out to that meeting in Wayne County, which was basically just like a public information session. Folks were able to come out, hear what officials were doing, and sort of get an update on those efforts to take those properties and typically what the playbook looks like. And I'm using Seneca County as an example. They go through the foreclosure list. The county or the entity associated with the county, the land bank, whatever it may be, obtains the properties through various foreclosure processes and either restores them, demolishes the home, splits the property up to neighbors, or puts it on the, just something to that effect, donates it back to Habitat, whatever, there's a lot of different options. It's interesting because I think that is probably, if you talk about things that could just make communities in the Finger Lakes feel better and look better along the way, and maybe elevate property values around these areas where these properties might drag it a little bit.
Right.
It's something that could, I think that's an effort that should be focused more on. And I think that's why I wanted to talk about it, because it isn't flashy. I'm sure there wasn't a mountain of people showing up to that
right.
information session, but I would just hope that elected officials don't take that as, well, this doesn't matter, we don't need to work on this. Right. Because it's huge. And I don't know if you, what your experience with that has been in Geneva, what you sort of seen and how it's treated.
Well, I mean, I think that, I think in Geneva, the staff are definitely on top of that as an issue and trying to figure out good solutions. But I can tell you that the first problem, from my view, the biggest problem is that there is no regulation, or if there is, there's no enforcement of a regulation, that the banks that take possession of the properties through foreclosure actually do anything. Now, granted, they're still subject to the same laws as any property owner are. So you can send them a letter and say, this needs to be cleaned up or we're going to do it for you. But it seems to me, and this is a place where county governments could band together and do some good, would be to try and get New York State to implement some kind of zombie property holding ordinance that would say, if you take possession of a vacant piece of land as a financial institution through foreclosure, there's a minimum standard of maintenance you have to maintain. And that is in everybody's best interest, because what ends up happening is a foreclosure or a bankruptcy proceeding is very long. And if nobody takes care of the property, first of all, we don't have city or county rehab crews that say, oh, I see that they're not, they've got some broken windows. Where's property? I mean, usually it's one of these large, kind of national or multinational banking establishments that have these properties. They don't take seriously the impact it's going to have on the community. And I mean, that's not right, because once it gets to a particular tipping point, usually the first point when it goes into foreclosure or bankruptcy, it could still be turned over fairly quickly. But you give it a year of being empty, nobody's checking in on the water or the heat, pipes freeze, stuff, animals get in. At that point, what you're doing is basically thumbing your nose at the neighbors and saying, you may never see this property in use again. It just might sit here. It might end up being demolished. You might just end up with an empty lot, but you're never going to have what you thought you had next to you. And I feel like I feel like a mortgage holder has an opportunity to, or an obligation to the community to not diminish the quality of life for the neighbors.
Yeah, and I can already imagine, the lender coming back and saying, well, hey, we didn't sign up for this. But the flip side of it is if you're offering a mortgage, right, you are, co-signing whatever and whoever is going in there. I guess, and, just while you were talking about that, I literally thought of, 5 or 6 properties that I see on my way between Brighton and Seneca Falls that I see when I get off the thruway. And those properties that, they don't have a for sale sign out in front of them. They clearly haven't been lived in for multiple years. Yep. And there again, you talk about, sort of the sticking it to the neighbors. That's pretty much exactly what, it comes down to. And I'm not sure, it's ironic because I think the will is there. There is interest to continue and carry on with these sort of investments, but it doesn't always seem to, I think if you shifted that from, say, priority 6 or 7 to priority 2 or 3, you could pretty quickly turn things around in some of these communities that are maybe for one reason or another struggling.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So let's talk about election season. It's here, basically. I mean,
it is.
It wouldn't have ordinarily
unexpectedly.
been here. So the process begins for local candidates to begin collecting petitions. February 26th, I believe, is the official date.
Yeah.
That means they will be walking through snow, sleet, ice, and cold weather from February 26th until April 1st, when petitions are due. I believe they're sort of checked that following week. Yep. And then we wait for a primary, which falls to June 26th this year. What are you hearing or seeing? Because I think that's where I wanted to sort of take the conversation on my side. What are you seeing and hearing from the people who are either thinking about running or are now running and maybe had a little less time to prepare than they would have ordinarily?
Yeah. I mean, I was excited to see that Brad Jones is running, right? I saw the article in the paper about him, and I think that's great. I think he's got a lot of good ideas. I think people trust him. He's got a good track record. In Geneva, this was my column this week. I'm trying to remain optimistic, but I think I don't know if people were caught unaware by this or not. I mean, I was. I didn't realize that everything was going to speed up to this extent, but I'm not hearing a lot of people interested in running, and that is concerning to me because you're always going to have a crop of people that immediately step forward and they're like, yep, I want to do it. And in my experience, those are usually the people that you need to say, okay, thanks for your interest, but maybe not, you know? You got to get to the group of people who don't see themselves as politically engaged or politically motivated, but actually are good, sensible people who understand why these decisions matter, and could pretty quickly come up to speed on what the process is and what the main issues are, but are just reasonable, decent people capable of disagreeing and have a backbone to say, well, actually, here's what I think, and here are my facts, and if you think differently, I'm open to that, but if you don't have new information, then we might not, I might not agree with what you're saying. And that, I'm hoping, is going to come to the fore in some way. I don't know. I think people are feeling simultaneously put off by what they see as the national attitude kind of trickling down to the local level, where people are more vicious and self-interested and just not necessarily the best people. And then, but on the other hand, I think you have a lot of people who understand that it's more important than ever to get the wrong people out of office, the self-interested people, and to finally just let regular, everyday people trying to live their lives have more of a say in local government, and that hopefully will trickle up. I know I keep saying that, but that we'll have more expectations of actually having responsive, tuned in, good, decent people running the country nationally.
So it's interesting. I've talked to some people who have been thinking about running, those kinds of people that you're talking, those on-the-fence people. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't... So I think that as you're saying, the national rhetoric is kind of trickling down.
Right.
But I think more than that, it's harder to see, you and I sit here and we talk about how great it is, how local politics is the lifeblood of virtually every community.
Yep.
If you really want to make an impact, if you really want to do something, if you really want to make a difference, go run for town council, go run for city council, go be town super, whatever. But the problem is, I think it's hard for folks to see the upside in it, or it's harder to see the upside in it. Because I think sometimes, and maybe this is just a result of years and years of sort of stalled policy in these small communities, it is not hard to pass a resolution at a town board meeting or a city council meeting and make some serious change.
Right. Right.
And I think people get a little bit confused about how gridlocked our national politics are and federal policy and state policy is, and let that sort of drive how they envision a potential term for them going if they ran for office and were successful.
Right.
And I think because of that, and there are a lot of other factors, I've talked to people who have said, you know what, I'd love to run, but unfortunately, I don't have time.
Yeah.
You know, I have a family. I have responsibilities at work that I can't really like dish off. My schedule doesn't allow it for one reason or another. Those factors, and I think that's where we've from time to time we talk about money as it pertains to elected office, and I think this is where attaching, and I don't mean to say when I use the word incentivize, I do not mean to give, those folks who have been entrenched and use politics to execute their will, their personal interests, a new stipend.
Right.
I'm talking about making it accessible to people who cannot give up their jobs. Because essentially, if you really want to do it, and I don't care if you're town supervisor in Seneca Falls or if you're town supervisor or you're a mayor of a big city. Right. It is, if you're going to do it right, it's a full-time job. And you should want to, and it seems to me that everyone should want locally elected officials to give a damn. Yeah. And you can't ask someone to give up their job, their day job, their career, or expect them to play some weird balancing act to just for the sake of running, for the good of the community. Now, I get it. Like, it's really nice to think about it that way, but I think a lot of folks don't. A lot of times when this conversation happens, they think about the worst thing they have ever seen in elected office. Yep. And when they think about more money, they automatically think about the worst town councilman they've ever seen. They automatically think about the worst mayor they ever remember. And they automatically associate that money with that person instead of looking at it from like a business would. We talked about, Ted Baker and I talked a few weeks ago at the end of 2018, I think we talked about ghosting in the workforce and how this phenomenon is becoming a thing that employers are having to deal with, businesses are having to deal with. What's the driver of it? A hyper-competitive market where employers are fighting over good employees. You have to pay your employee. You have to pay your public servant if you want them to do a job. Now, another thing that I feel wrongly gets tied into this is state legislature, the raise they get causes all kinds of chaos. Right. What have they done? What have they not? It becomes this big thing. And now it's another thing that people are going to associate with this idea that if you want your local, especially rural, if you want your local elected officials to care and to do the right things and to be the best possible versions of themselves as elected officials or public servants, you've got to, there has to be a concession on that side. There has to be a reasonable expectation that, I think a town councilor in Seneca Falls and surrounding communities gets something like an $8,000 or $9,000 stipend. City council in Geneva is what, like $4,000,
$4,000,
which is just, it's laughable. I mean, for as active as most of, even the worst of city council in Geneva is active enough to deserve more than $4,000. And that's where I feel like this whole thing is just, it gets lost on people. But, if you are working at Gould's or you're working at, somewhere in Rochester or wherever the case may be, and you wouldn't be able to give up your job to do this job, I think a lot of people just aren't going to bother doing it in the first place. They aren't even going to consider running.
Right.
So you're automatically hurting out what, like 60, 70% of the population? I don't know. It's tough, and it's a weird balance, right? Like,
well, and I'm really conflicted about this because here's an area in my life where I really feel like a hypocrite, which is, like, in my view, the worst possible thing you could ever be, is to be a hypocrite. So,
for an ethics professor, that's probably an accurate statement.
And I feel like this is where I am, because on one hand, I have these personal hangups about money where I feel like if I'm getting paid for something, then it somehow is like muddying my motivation. Like, I think people should run for public office because it's the right thing to do and you serve your community and you shouldn't need to get paid. However, I understand that in reality, what ends up happening is if you pay a Geneva City Councilor $4,000, which is what they get, which I agree with you, is laughable. The amount of stuff going on in the city and how critically important it is, the work is. No wonder it goes the way it does. Thank goodness we have decently paid staff because they are what keep things running, right? Yeah. But if you look at it, I think it does. I think low compensation does have a detrimental effect, but maybe not for the reason that you're saying. I'm not sure that it holds people out of office because I do think in general, city council, although to do it well, it needs to be on your mind full time. I don't believe it's a full time in your seat position, meaning like I don't think you're in meetings present at stuff 40 hours a week. I think you're always thinking about it. You're never off duty, that's for sure. You go to Wegmans, you're on. Like, there's no quiet time. But actually, I try to pitch to people that it's a really great thing to do for people who already do have a full-time job because it's an evening commitment and the actual dedicated time is fairly low as long as you're flexible to have these kind of other thoughts and engagements with people over time. During what would otherwise be typical work hours, I guess. But here's what I think is the issue. By not paying your elected officials very much, the community expects less. So right now, we've got some city councilors who I think are essentially phoning it in. They show up for the meetings. It's clear they haven't read anything coming up to that point. They've got to have things re-explained to them by staff that, oh, yeah, we sent you that last week. And then they nod, oh, you're right, which I'm thinking, no. I know you never saw it because you didn't check your email, but whatever. So there are guys who don't look like they know what's going on. And women. I don't want to exclude the female city councilor, who I also don't think looks like she knows what's going on half the time. So that's what I really think. So anyway, I think people leave the meetings and they think, well, they're only getting $4,000 a year anyway, so I guess what can we expect? So maybe if city council were smaller and could afford to pay people a little bit more, maybe you'd have people leaving the meetings in an outrage saying, I can't believe that person's getting $10,000 of my tax money to do nothing. Maybe that would be a benefit of paying people more in elected office, that the community would hold their feet to the fire a little bit more about getting their money's worth. Because right now, you're right. People are getting about what they pay for, and it's not much.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. Like, I get where you're coming from completely. Like, the expectation associated with it. I understand that. I just think there's, because the other thing that I thought about after the fact was, it is going to have, so say you run for office over the course of a 2 or 4 year term, there are going to be situations where you are going to have to say to your employer, hey, such and such came up.
Right.
I'm really sorry. Mm-hmm. Employers aren't as receptive to that today as they were 20 or 30 years ago, where, their interests were more represented. If, you think back to the glory days of, or I guess the glory days, if you consider them that, of the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even 90s in some of these small communities where, like, local businesses were then heard through the people who were employed and representing the community as
all right,
as
you
a
can
whole.
call them the glory days. I'm going to dissent from that characterization.
That's what people characterize them as.
Okay, right. I know they do. Yes, they do.
Where you could do both. You could wear both hats. Mm-hmm. You could be, you could work at Gould's, or you could work at, I keep saying Gould's. You could work at any business, and the business understood that you had commitments related to that public service. I guarantee you most businesses, especially small businesses, are going to say, you're checked out. See ya.
Yep.
And it isn't reasonable. That's another one of the reasons why something has to give. Something has to change because the system just doesn't work. I mean, people criticizing, I have a lot of friends who don't live in this area, and they talk and they'll say, boy, for being the birthplace of women's rights, Seneca Falls and the communities around it sure look awfully old, white, and male. Yeah. And you know what? Like, there's a reason why. I mean, other than the demographics of these small communities, that's another issue. But there's a reason why you don't see anyone other than retired people getting involved in politics.
Yeah, it ends up being a luxury. I mean, local politics ends up being a luxury. Amen. And it shouldn't be. In my view, it should be a necessity. We should draw lots. You serve your time on city council because your number came up, not because you wanted to. That would be an eye-opener for people. But, all right, legislative draft, that's what I'm introducing right now as my policy initiative to fix everything. I think people should be compelled to serve just like jury duty. You should have to do some time on your city council or your town board, and I think that would change things. It'd make it interesting.
The unfortunate part is, just like draft service, just like jury duty, you're going to find people who find their way out of it.
Sure, but in this case, the people who could weasel their way out of it would be exactly the people you don't want in it anyway. That would be a win.
Oh, no. See, I think we're at a place now where our political system is so not just politicized, but polarized, that I think you're going to get those folks who are already detached and disconnected.
Right.
And they're going to say, I don't want to do this.
Right.
I don't want to be bothered with this. Think about it. Like, as dreadful as jury duty is.
I don't find it dreadful.
A lot of, most people. I would be willing to guess that probably like 90% of the population finds it dreadful.
You're just reinforcing that I just feel like an outsider everywhere. Yep, okay.
There is, in theory, no better way to be part of the system.
That's right.
To be good, to be the just part of society.
Yes, exactly.
But still, people don't want to do it.
Well, I know.
It's like,
I know. Isn't that the struggle? Everybody wants, in theory, responsible, engaged, good communities. And in practice, nobody wants to do the work. Well, very few people. But we got to change that. All right. I'm not sure we're going to solve that today.
Well, and it's interesting. One more thing. So I think maybe there was a time when there was more connectivity between elected office and some of like the community organizations that we see, where like you sort of rise through the ranks of not just like political committees,
right. Mm-hmm.
but like actual like clubs and organizations.
Yeah.
Sort of get your feet wet in the whole like process of, talking to people and sorting through problems and that sort of thing. And then sort of graduating your way up along the path. Maybe that's a way, maybe that's a vehicle to kind of change the tone. I still think there are problems on the fiscal side that need to be addressed, right. The monetary side. But maybe that's a vehicle to kind of drive some change. The different kinds of clubs, the Kiwanis, KFC, all of those. But yeah, it's tricky stuff.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, we've got about 10 minutes. Let's talk about two Cuomo things.
Okay.
He says he's open to restoring AIM funding.
Okay.
Obviously, we debated this whole thing.
Yep.
I had an interesting thought the other day. I was like, what if this was just his way of giving upstate legislators who are in the super minority now a win that isn't really a win, just to sort of serve as a concession and nothing else. So think about this theory. If you're the governor, you threaten to take something away. And because you have all the levers of government at your disposal, you can, in fact, take that thing away. Mm-hmm. You let it sit and you let it sort of simmer for a couple weeks like it has. And then you turn around and you say, well, I'm open to keeping it. And then those legislators in upstate rural New York in the Finger Lakes are spending spending so much time and energy trying to fight to restore this. I've been getting press releases out the wazoo of mayors and supervisors and board chairman going to Albany and speaking on this issue. And our state lawmakers locally have been doing the same thing. And they're spending all of their energy on this thing that really shouldn't even be a thing. And they're not focusing on any of the things, or in theory, they're not putting as much attention on the things that might actually create change or might actually be of interest to the folks they're representing.
That is a crafty and devious plan that you've laid out and might be true. I
was hoping you were going to be the optimist here and be like, no, that's not possible.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I hope that's not what's happening. I mean, I realize my brain doesn't work in that way. So, like, you're saying this and my eyes are getting wide, like, oh my goodness, could that be what's really going on? And then you say it and it's like, that makes a lot of sense. How terrible. I don't know. That could very well be it. That could be it. I mean, yeah, maybe
it's almost
he is just engaging them in this very prolonged distraction so that they don't make problems for him in other ways.
It's almost like when you look at local municipalities are going through the budget process.
Yeah.
And they say, well, our budget was, I'm going to use a round number, $10 million this year. Everybody throws their number, all the department heads throw their numbers at it, and all of a sudden you're up to $10.5 million. And they say that the person who's leading that effort says, well, we're going to reduce it by 10%. Well, what are you reducing it from? The 10.5 or the 10? And what happens if you spend all of your time and your energy reducing from that 10.5 to get to 10.3 and you still have that net 0.3 increase?
Right.
And it's sort of it's that same kind of theory where, like, you're spending all of your time and all your energy on this objective that is actually sitting next to the thing that you should be working on instead of the thing itself.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just throwing ideas out there, people.
It's like a legislative Trojan horse. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of it that way.
So the other Cuomo item, he met with Donald Trump and President Donald Trump, and I guess that was probably, from what I've read thus far, it sounds like it was about as productive as I would have guessed it'd be. The president wasn't thrilled with the abortion bill that was passed in New York State, and he floated fracking to the governor. Two areas where the governor is clearly not going to budge in any way, shape, or form. This, of course, as the governor is asking for restoration to some degree of the salt monies that were coming from the federal government. It's interesting to me because that's like, two people on such polar ends of the spectrum in terms of politics. And, when you get these people in a room together, how productive do you think it's going to be? I mean, even if they agreed on 90% of the things they talked about, we're never going to see it. And because of the political forces at play, and because the president is up for re-election next year, you're never going to see him actually move in an area where it may even potentially look like he's conceding to a Democrat.
Sure. And I mean, I don't know. I don't put any stock in that kind of meeting anyway, because the president's moral outrage about anything just seems hollow to me. Plus, I mean, we all know, he was for abortion before he was against it. So it's all political. Like, there's no genuine outrage there for anything unless he was personally insulted by something. But I just don't. I guess I'm never going to say that dialogue is a bad thing and that people shouldn't talk. But if we think that this was anything that was meant to be more than just two guys grandstanding about how much they don't like each other, I think that was mistaken. I mean, what was really going to come from that?
Well, and then sort of the other part of it when I was thinking about this leading up to the episode was just, how can someone from Albany go to Washington and say, look at us, we're in trouble, we need your help, when Albany is collectively maybe the biggest mess of all state governments in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, that is our our state legislature needs a lot of cleaning up. And before they all start patting themselves on the back about how great some of these reforms are, they need to understand that they haven't even, it's like saying, oh man, see, I've been sick, so the analogies are not coming as quickly to me as they otherwise would be. But basically, we were starting from a deficit position, right? Like Albany's politics has been so bad that all these reforms are still just the tip of the iceberg. We're not even back to like parity, like zero, like where things might be just to be decent, let alone making any strides towards things getting better. So, yeah, I think the governor's efforts are best spent focusing on making the New York State legislature a functioning legislative body that effectively represents the interests of the varied and unique perspectives of people across the state of New York. That is a job unto itself, and it needs more attention.
Yeah, and I'm not sure we're even close to a point where change on that front. I think just in the fiscal terms, it's where do you even begin? And that's where I think the you can talk about campaign finance, you can talk about taxes, you can talk about education. And like we said at the start of the show, all of these things are indirectly connected, but separate issues that all are very complicated to address.
Yeah. And
maybe you just start somewhere and you just start trying stuff, but I'm not sure anybody would take the political risk associated with that one.
Right. Well, that's ultimately what it comes down to. That's the common thread. You need people in public office that are willing to take risks. And they're not huge risks. It's like the risk of just saying something unpopular because it's the right thing to say.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's in short supply amongst the people that are currently running things at many levels.
Okay, so are you watching? Is there anything I wanted to ask you, because we haven't done this in a while. We used to do that whole story to watch thing. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you are paying particularly close attention to right now, or watching or listening to that should be on people's radar?
Besides the stuff we've already talked about. Well, okay, I am really closely interested in the city's rezoning efforts. I don't know that anybody else cares about that, but I'm gonna write a column about that because I think that is important. And zoning might be the thing that people find to be the most boring topic to talk about, but I just think it's where a lot of the action is, because people care about zoning when they want to do something with their property, so they should care about zoning when it's being drafted. But yeah, that's what I'm keeping my eye on, the zoning process in Geneva.
It matters. It all matters. I'm watching elections right now. A lot of committees are meeting within the next couple of weeks just to figure out who's going to run. I'm sort of wondering if we're not going to see some of the more rural districts. I can think of a few historically in the last 5 years in Wayne County that have seen vacancies after elections, and with the press time, I could see it happening again. So that's kind of where I'm watching over the next couple of weeks, because I don't think we're going to see many people jump in after February 26th. Once we get to the start of petition time, I don't think you're going to see new faces jump into the fold. So really, it comes down to the next 2 weeks to determine what those rosters are going to look like.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. We'll be back next week, maybe at the end of this week, with another episode. Ted Baker might be in. But until then, check us out on Facebook, facebook.com/debriefpod. Also, check us out on anchor.fm. We've got all of the links to all of our podcast services where this podcast is available. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.